There is a profound, aching kind of poverty that has absolutely nothing to do with the emptiness of a man's pockets or the balance of his ledger. It is a quiet, eroding lack that takes root deep inside the spirit, thriving in the mind of someone who looks at everything he has built and chooses to see only the spaces where something is missing. He can look out across his land, counting the acres he owns, and find them far too few to ever mean anything. He can walk among his livestock, counting his cattle, and see them only as too thin, too fragile to withstand the harsh realities of the world. He can look back over the slow progression of his years and find them too quiet, too unremarkable, entirely devoid of the grand markers of success that society praises. From all this careful, deliberate counting, he ultimately arrives at a single, devastating conclusion: that he himself is simply not enough. Nathan Cole was exactly that kind of man. At 34 years old, he found himself running a modest, weathered cattle ranch tucked away on the lonely western edge of Millbrook, Wyoming. It was 300 acres of decent, honest land, but in his mind, it was land that never quite managed to produce what he needed it to, always falling just short of the imagined mark. On that property sat an old timber barn that had somehow survived 12 brutal Wyoming winters, though it had achieved this feat through sheer, stubborn resistance to the elements, rather than any strength Nathan believed he had given it. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, a heavy, suffocating silence would settle over the ranch. It was a vacuum of sound that Nathan had long ago learned to fill with relentless, exhausting physical labor. He threw himself into chores after dark because work, at least, gave him a tangible place to put his calloused hands, a way to keep his mind from drifting into the shadowed corners of his own perceived failures. Yet, it is vital to understand that Nathan was not a bitter man. He did not harbor a toxic resentment toward the world, nor did he look at the grand fortunes of other men with an envious or spiteful eye. He was simply a man who had decided, somewhere a long way back in his history, that he occupied a very specific, unchanging tier of human existence. In his own estimation, he belonged to the realm of the decent, the honest, the hard-working, and the thoroughly adequate. He believed with an absolute, unshakable certainty that the truly beautiful and extraordinary things in life belonged exclusively to other, higher tiers of existence. Certain grand experiences and certain exceptional people were meant for a different kind of man entirely. Emily Harper, specifically, was a person he placed on that unreachable shelf. Emily lived on the neighboring property just across the eastern fence line, managing a tidy 40-acre spread that boasted a sturdy, well-framed house her father had lovingly built with his own hands. Her property featured a vibrant kitchen garden that consistently produced a rich, green abundance, a seasonal miracle that Nathan's sprawling acres never quite seemed to duplicate. For 8 long years, she had been his closest neighbor, and for the vast majority of that time, she had been his dearest friend. Emily possessed a rare, particular quality that defied easy description. She had a way of making the most exhausting, bone-weary days feel entirely manageable simply by being present within them. Her laughter could cut through the biting high plains wind, and her steady gaze could ground a man when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Nathan had been deeply, quietly in love with her for approximately 6 of those 8 years. He had never allowed the words to form on his tongue, nor did he ever intend to say them aloud to her. Nathan kept his heart locked tight, because he genuinely believed that Emily Harper deserved far more than a man who counted wrong. He believed she belonged to a life of security, luxury, and ease, things he could never provide on his struggling ranch. He held on to this self-sacrificing conviction with a fierce, protective stubbornness, protecting her from his own lack, right up until a crisp Tuesday morning in September. It was a morning when she walked across a dusty barn floor, looked him in the eyes, and broke through his numbers to tell him the absolute truth about what things were actually worth. To truly understand how they arrived at that moment, one has to understand what 8 years of neighboring looks like when it is stripped of pretense. It looks like spending long, grueling days fixing each other's splintered fences after the chaotic spring floods have washed out the gullies. It means doing the work without ever being asked, and more importantly, doing it without ever keeping a score of who owed what. It looks like sharing the steep, heavy cost of digging a new well when the old one went completely dry 2 summers prior, sitting at a sunlit kitchen table over mugs of black coffee to work out the water right. There were no lawyers involved in those discussions because neither of them could afford legal fees, and neither of them needed a contract to trust the other's word. Neighbouring meant Emily suddenly appearing at Nathan's front door with a jar of hot soup and a basket of bread when a brutal winter fever kept him shivering in bed for a week in 1881. It meant Nathan spending 3 straight days exposed on Emily's roof after a devastating hailstorm shattered half her shingles, both of them casually pretending these were just the ordinary, mundane tasks neighbours performed for one another, rather than the deeply specific, protective acts these 2 particular people did because they could not bear to see the other suffer. It looks like knowing the intricate, unwritten map of another person's daily life. It means knowing exactly how they take their coffee in the morning and which horse they will instinctively reach for when the day ahead promises to be exceptionally hard. It means recognizing the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the tone of their voice when something is terribly wrong, even when their spoken words insist that everything is perfectly fine. Nathan knew every single one of these details about Emily. He knew she took her coffee incredibly strong, black, with absolutely no sugar to sweeten the bite. He knew she always reached for the reins of the grey mare when she had a heavy problem weighing on her mind and needed the space of the open prairie to think things through. He knew with absolute certainty that when she said the words, "I'm all right," quickly and without a breath of a pause, she was actually not all right at all. But this was precisely where Nathan's internal math went completely wrong. He stubbornly believed that this deep, intimate knowledge was merely the kind of data a loyal friend accumulates over years of proximity, not the kind of truth a man has the right to act upon. Emily was a beautiful, intelligent woman, and she certainly had other options in the valley. There was a wealthy merchant from Cheyenne who came courting with fine manners, and a prosperous ranch owner from the North Valley whose massive operation was more than 3 times the size of Nathan's modest acreage. Emily had quietly but firmly declined all of their advances over the years, a fact that Nathan consistently attributed to her simply being incredibly particular about her company. To attribute her refusal of those wealthy suitors to any lingering affection for himself would have required Nathan to open his heart to hope. In his experience, hope was the most expensive, dangerous luxury a man could ever cultivate. He had learned the hard way to be exceedingly careful with his hope. The brutal winter his father lost the family's original prosperous ranch had burned that lesson deep into his bones. It was the winter Nathan had been forced to start over from absolute nothing, taking on a smaller patch of unforgiving land, weighed down by a crushing mountain of debt. He was only 17 years old, suddenly carrying the survival of his family on his young shoulders, learning in the freezing cold that wanting things too directly, or loving them too openly, was a reliable way to watch them get torn away from you. So, he had trained himself to want things quietly, almost sideways, finding a way to exist in the small, unnoticed gaps between other obligations. It was, he had thoroughly decided, the only responsible, mature way for a man like him to live. He never allowed himself to examine too closely the heavy, silent cost of that protection. Then came September, a month that in Wyoming possesses a legendary, fleeting quality. The suffocating, dusty heat of the summer suddenly breaks, and the air turns remarkably crisp and clear, carrying the sharp scent of distant pine and early frost. The autumn light shifts, turning into a rich, liquid gold that bathes the landscape, making the rugged mountains, the rolling amber grass, and the old weathered wood of the ranch buildings look like they had been deliberately placed into an oil painting. It was a beautiful landscape that looked as though it had earned its colors through surviving the seasons. Nathan and Emily maintained a long-standing habit of sharing the morning livestock feeding on Tuesdays. Her barn happened to sit closer to the shared water trough, while his barn possessed a larger loft for storing winter hay. The arrangement had been born out of practical, efficient motivations years ago, but over the slow passage of time, it had evolved into simply a Tuesday thing, one of the small, unshakable anchors around which they built their entire week. They worked together with the comfortable, rhythmic efficiency of people who have shared a physical task for so long that they no longer required spoken instructions to coordinate their movements. On that particular Tuesday morning, the air inside the barn was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of sweet alfalfa hay, leather horses, and the old, dry pine of the walls. It was a collection of smells that Nathan inwardly associated, without ever consciously analyzing the depth of the connection, with everything that was genuinely good, safe, and true about his life. Emily had been uncharacteristically quiet as they tossed the feed, moving with a slower grace that Nathan recognized not as a sign of trouble, but as the quiet behavior of a woman deep in thought. He respected her silence, letting the morning unfold without forcing unnecessary conversation. But as they reached the end of the line, she paused, leaning against the wooden slats of a stall. "I heard Arthur Whitmore is coming through the valley next month," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the horses. Nathan's hands froze for a fraction of a second over the feed bucket before he forced himself to resume his rhythm, his face a mask of calm. "Is that so?" he replied, keeping his voice carefully level. "A business trip, I assume?" "Apparently," Emily murmured, shifting her weight slightly. "He wrote a letter to my father once, a long time ago, before Papa passed away. Papa always thought very highly of him. He always said Arthur would be a good prospect for the future." The name Arthur Whitmore carried a massive weight in the territory. He was a notorious cattle baron from the Northern Territories, a wealthy, influential man whose sweeping, sophisticated operation made Nathan's modest ranch look like nothing more than a poorly tended kitchen garden. Nathan felt a cold, familiar weight settle into the pit of his stomach, the old math instantly calculating the vast distance between himself and a man of Whitmore's stature. He swallowed the bitterness before it could reach his throat, determined to be the honourable neighbour he had always promised to be. "Whitmore is a serious man, Emily," Nathan said, his voice entirely devoid of the jealousy that was currently trying to crack his ribs. "He can provide a grand life." He believed this completely, filing his own silence under the strict heading of responsibility, refusing to look at the devastating cost it would exact from his soul. The morning light continued to cut through the gaps in the barn walls, casting long, straight bars of gold across the dusty floor where they stood. The horses chewed their grain with a rhythmic, comforting sound, entirely unaware of the silent storm raging inside the man standing just a few feet away. Nathan looked at those golden beams of light and thought about the immense world Arthur Whitmore occupied. He imagined a life spanning 30 or 40 years, unfolding in a grand two-story house with fine curtains, sturdy furniture, and a kitchen that never knew the lean anxiety of a bad winter. He thought about what it meant to love someone truly, weighing his own quiet devotion against the tangible security a cattle baron could offer. To Nathan, the answer was as clear as the Wyoming sky. The most loving, honourable thing he could do for Emily Harper was to step back completely and refuse to stand in the way of a better, brighter future. He believed this with the fierce, stubborn conviction of a man who had been raised on sacrifice, cataloguing his own heartbreak under the strict heading of duty. He deliberately chose not to examine the emptiness that would remain when she was gone. The next afternoon, 3 miles away, the conversation took a very different turn inside a bright, sun-washed kitchen. Margaret Dear had been Emily's closest confidant since they were 7 years old, a bond forged in childhood games and cemented through decades of shared secrets. Margaret was a woman who possessed many fine qualities, but as Emily frequently loved to remind her, she was constitutionally incapable of keeping an opinion to herself when she saw her friends stumbling. Setting down a heavy ceramic teapot with a sharp click, Margaret looked across the table and went straight to the heart of the matter. "You're going to let Arthur Whitmore ride into this valley, tip his fine hat, and make an offer for your hand, aren't you?" Margaret asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what's worse, you're actually going to sit there and consider it seriously." Emily sighed, her fingers tracing the smooth rim of her teacup as she looked out at her flourishing garden. "I am going to be polite, Margaret," she answered softly. "The man was a respected friend of my father's, and it would be an insult to Papa's memory to treat him with anything less than complete respect. Margaret let out a sharp, impatient breath and leaned across the table, her expression shifting from irritation to a deep, protective seriousness. "Emily, look at me," she commanded, waiting until her friend raised her eyes. "I love you too much to watch you play this game. If you won't say the name that's actually written on your heart, then I'm just going to say it out loud for you. Nathan Cole." The name seemed to hang in the quiet air of the kitchen, carrying a weight that made both women pause. Emily looked down at her lap, her posture softening as the defensive armor she usually wore began to fray at the edges. "He doesn't see it that way, Margaret," Emily whispered, her voice cracking slightly with a vulnerability she rarely showed to the world. "Not once in 8 long years has that man given me any real indication that he thinks of me as anything more than a reliable neighbor or a convenient friend." She paused, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat before continuing. "A man who wanted a life with me, a man who wanted more than just a helping hand with his fences, would have found the courage to say something by now." Margaret shook her head slowly, her gaze softening with a profound, intuitive pity for the two stubborn neighbors. "Or, Emily, a man who doesn't believe he deserves a single good thing in this life stays quiet because staying quiet feels a whole lot safer than being told no," Margaret said carefully, her voice dropping to a gentle, urgent register. "Nathan looks at himself and sees a ruined ranch and an empty ledger. He thinks keeping his mouth shut is an act of chivalry." Emily remained entirely silent, turning her head to stare out the window at the dusty lane that stretched between their properties. "He counts everything wrong," she said finally, the words slipping out as a quiet, weary confession. "He measures his acres, he measures his cattle, he measures the winters, and every single time he does the math, he finds himself short. He is so busy looking at what's missing that he can't see what's right in front of his face." She stopped herself, drawing a sharp breath and squaring her shoulders. "But I'm not going to sit here and confess my soul to you first. If I say those words out loud, I am going to say them directly to him." The formal letter from Arthur Whitmore arrived at the Millbrook post office on a Friday morning, acting as a tangible catalyst for the tension that had been building in the valley. Nathan happened to be loading supplies onto his wagon when he saw Emily step out onto the porch of the post office, holding the crisp white envelope in her hands. Even from a distance, he saw the unmistakable return address, and he watched the slight, subtle change in her expression as she read the elegant script. He felt a familiar, dull ache in his chest, but he immediately looked away and tightened the straps on his wagon. It wasn't his business, he reminded himself. He had no right to comment on her correspondence or her suitors. He drove his team home through the dust, went straight to the south pasture, and spent the remaining daylight hours furiously repairing a long section of barbed wire fence that had been sagging for 2 weeks. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, driving wooden posts into the hard earth until his muscles screamed and his hands bled, simply because the brutal physical labor gave him a temporary refuge from his thoughts. That evening, the autumn wind began to howl across the plains, rattling the loose boards of his old barn. Nathan sat on his porch with a tin mug of black coffee that had gone completely cold, staring out into the vast, dark emptiness of the Wyoming night. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think with absolute, terrifying honesty about what the coming weeks would bring. Whitmore would be arriving in exactly 21 days, and a man of his stature didn't travel across territories just to look at cattle. He was coming for Emily. Anyone with eyes could see how extraordinary she was, and Whitmore possessed the wealth, the influence, and the power to offer her a life that Nathan could only dream of providing. The word compete flashed through his mind, but he instantly dismissed it with a bitter, humorless smile. To compete implied that he was actually in the running, which required a declaration he had never found the courage to make. He was just a spectator in her life, a neighbor who fixed roofs and shared water rights, trapped in a prison of his own making because speaking the truth felt like asking for a prize he hadn't earned. Over the next 2 days, the words that Margaret had spoken to Emily, which had invariably traveled through the small-town gossip chain until they reached Nathan's ears through a mutual friend, haunted his every waking hour. A man who doesn't believe he deserves more stays quiet. The phrase cut through his defenses like a knife, exposing the ugly truth he had hidden beneath the respectable coat of deliberation and responsibility. He wasn't being noble by staying silent. He was being a coward. He was hiding behind his poverty and his struggling ranch because he was terrified of opening his heart and being told that he truly wasn't enough. Yet, despite this sudden, agonizing self-awareness, he reached no new conclusions and took no action. He watched the sun rise and set over the mountains, realizing with a sense of deep shame that his continued silence was a profound failure of courage, masquerading as careful thought. The white letter sat in Emily's house just 3 fields away, a ticking clock marking the final days of his old life, while Nathan sat alone on his porch, trapped in his numbers, watching the gold light of September slowly fade into winter. 3 weeks melted away with the terrifying, unyielding speed of water rushing through a broken dam. The long-awaited Tuesday arrived, bringing with it the familiar routine of the morning feeding, but the air inside the old barn felt entirely different this time. The autumn light still cut through the weathered wooden slats in long, sharp beams of liquid gold. The horses still stamped their hooves impatiently against the dirt, and the sweet, dusty aroma of alfalfa hay still hung heavily in the air. Yet, an invisible, suffocating wall of tension had settled between the two neighbors, a silence so thick and heavy that it made every breath feel like an effort. The entire town of Millbrook had spent the previous evening whispering about the fine carriage that had rolled into the livery yard. Arthur Whitmore had finally arrived in the valley, and his shadow seemed to loom over the entire morning. Nathan and Emily worked side by side, tossing flakes of hay into the mangers with a frantic mechanical efficiency, both of them keeping their eyes fixed resolutely on their work to avoid looking at each other. The silence grew so loud that the sound of Nathan's own pulse began to thud in his ears, a frantic rhythm that demanded a release before it tore him apart. Without looking up from the heavy galvanized feed bucket he was gripping with white knuckles, Nathan finally forced his cracked lips to move, delivering the words he had been guarding like a visual secret for 21 agonizing days. He spoke them with a forced, artificial lightness, the desperate way a man tries to handle a weight that is far too heavy to carry any other way. "You should give Whitmore a fair chance when he comes to court you today, Emily," Nathan said, his voice straining against the tightness in his throat as he kept his back turned to her. "A powerful man like that, he has the means to give you everything in this world that you truly deserve." He paused, swallowing a bitter lump of pride before adding the final, crushing blow to his own heart. "You belong in a grand house, Emily. You deserve a wealthy man who doesn't have to count his pennies." The heavy silence returned to the barn, broken only by the sharp, sudden clatter of Emily's tin feed pail hitting the dirt floor with an echoing ring. Nathan froze, his heart hammering against his ribs as he slowly turned around to face her. Emily was standing less than 3 feet away, having crossed the distance between them with a quiet, purposeful intensity that completely shattered their usual boundaries. She wasn't crying and she wasn't yelling, but her face bore an expression of fierce, absolute finality, the look of a patient woman who had reached the absolute end of a very long road and had decided, right then and there, to be entirely done with indirection, numbers, and fear. Before he could find his breath to speak, she reached out and placed her warm, calloused hand directly over his, where it rested on the wooden fence rail. Nathan went completely, utterly still, the warmth of her palm sending a sudden shock through his entire body as the world around them seemed to narrow down to the point of contact between their skin. "Nathan," Emily said, her voice remarkably steady, cutting through the quiet dampness of the room with the force of an absolute truth. "I need you to stop counting what's missing from your life." She paused for a single heartbeat, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, unwavering intensity that refused to let him look away. "I need you to look down right now and count this." She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she pressed her fingers firmer against his, cementing her presence in a way that defied every rule of safety and distance he had spent 8 years constructing. The old barn became profoundly quiet, save for the soft, distant rustle of a horse shifting its weight in a neighboring stall. Nathan stared down at her hand covering his rough skin, then raised his gaze to look into her eyes, and in that singular, golden moment, the intricate maze of numbers and equations he had lived by for 6 years completely collapsed into dust. With the sudden blinding clarity of a traveler who has just realized he has been reading his map upside down for years, Nathan understood that he had been solving the completely wrong problem. He had spent a lifetime calculating his worth based on acres, cattle, and the strength of his barn, entirely blind to the fact that love didn't keep a ledger. For a long, agonizing moment, he couldn't find a single word to say. It wasn't because he was confused about his own feelings. He had known exactly how much he loved this woman since the day they dug the well together, but because his spirit was struggling to catch up to the reality of what was happening. When you spend almost a decade carefully managing an ache, protecting yourself from the pain of its absence, the sudden, overwhelming presence of the thing you wanted most requires a terrifying emotional adjustment. He looked at her beautiful, determined face, his voice trembling as the old armor made one last, desperate attempt to protect him. "Emily, you know what I have. I don't have the things a woman like you—" "Don't," Emily interrupted him softly, her fingers tightening affectionately around his hand to silence the protest before it could leave his lips. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me what you don't have, Nathan Cole. I have lived across the field from you for 8 years. I know exactly what your ledger looks like, and I know every broken board on this ranch. But I also know exactly what you do have, because I have been paying very close attention to the way you live your life." A gentle, radiant smile broke through the seriousness of her face, softening the tension in her jaw. "My accounting system is entirely different from yours, Nathan. I don't measure a man by the size of his shadow." Nathan looked at her hand, his thumb tracking the smooth line of her knuckles as a slow, unfamiliar warmth began to bloom deep inside his chest. "You're going to have to help me learn that," he whispered, a faint, vulnerable smile finally touching the corner of his mouth. "The new math, the different accounting." "I know," Emily murmured, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and deep affection. "In fact, I've been quietly planning to take over your books for quite some time now." A soft laugh escaped her lips, breaking the last remnants of the heavy silence that had haunted the barn for weeks. "Arthur Whitmore didn't stand a chance, Nathan. He arrived about 6 years too late to this valley." Nathan stared at her, overwhelmed by the profound grace of the woman standing before him. This was the neighbor who had shown up week after week, season after season, looking at his muddy boots, his struggling cattle, and his insufficient winters, and had somehow found something within all of that struggle that was worth choosing. With a deliberate, steady movement, Nathan turned his hand over beneath hers, lacing his fingers through hers and gripping them tightly. "I have been an absolute fool," he admitted softly, "a careful, well-intentioned, terrified fool." Emily nodded, her eyes bright with tears. "Yes, you certainly have. But you're finally here now, Nathan. That's all that matters." What followed between them possessed the seamless, natural quality of an ancient river finding its true channel after decades of being blocked by rock. There was no theatrical performance of discovery, no frantic rush to remake themselves, but rather the quiet, deeply grounding pleasure of finally naming a truth that had lived in the marrow of their bones for 8 long years. They already knew the intricate map of each other's spirits. They knew how the other thought, how they handled exhaustion, how they argued, and how they recovered from a blow. When Arthur Whitmore was informed that Sunday afternoon, with a warmth and an absolute unshakable clarity that left no room for negotiation, that Emily Harper was no longer available, the great cattle baron took the news with far more grace than Nathan ever could have mustered. He offered a polite bow, wished her a prosperous future, and departed the valley on the morning stagecoach. Later that evening, Nathan came calling at her front porch properly, carrying a bundle of wild blue asters he had gathered from the banks of the North Creek. He hadn't arranged them in any sophisticated way, his hands still trembling slightly as he handed them over, but Emily accepted them as if they were precious jewels, placing them in a clear glass jar on her kitchen windowsill, where the morning sun would always find them.
The shared Tuesdays in the old barn continued exactly as they always had, different now only in the profound reality that the long silences were replaced by quiet, practical conversations about a future they had formally agreed to build together. On a biting evening in late November, with the first true snow of the season beginning to drift down soft and silent over the valley, they sat side by side on Emily's porch, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the white flakes blanket the sleeping earth. "I want to show you something, Nathan," she murmured, her breath forming a faint white cloud in the frosty air. He turned his head to look at her, his arm tightening around her waist. "What's that?" She pointed a mittened hand across the darkening yard toward the silhouette of his property. "I want to show you how to count your life differently." She nodded toward the old building in the distance. "Look at your barn, Nathan. It is still standing tall after 12 brutal winters. In a country that breaks stronger things every year, that timber held." Nathan remained quiet for a long moment, letting her words sink into the places that had felt empty for so long. "Yes," he whispered, "it held." Emily smiled against his jacket, and the south pasture came in nearly twice as thick this year as it did the year before. And when William Hester offered you that fair price on the North cattle last month, you took it, didn't you? You didn't let your fear tell you it was a trick. Nathan nodded slowly, a profound sense of peace washing over him. "I did. I took the deal." Emily turned her face up to meet his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the soft white light of the falling snow. "Now look at me," she whispered, repeating the words that had changed everything. "Count this." Nathan looked at her, counting the warmth of her body against his, the absolute certainty of her presence, and the incredible journey that had brought her across a dusty barn floor into his arms. He nodded, a tear freezing on his cheek as he arrived at a conclusion that had taken him 34 years to find. "The numbers. They look entirely different from this side of the ledger, Emily." He asked her formally to marry him in the middle of December, standing on the porch of his own ranch on a fiercely cold, crystal-clear evening, while the mountains showed their sharp winter faces against a velvet sky. He had fetched his grandmother's ring from the bottom of an old tin lockbox, a simple, elegant band of solid gold that had been worn completely smooth by decades of honest work and devotion. He had carried that ring in his vest pocket for 3 straight weeks before finding the courage to speak, a lingering habit of caution that made Emily laugh softly when he finally confessed it. They had been discussing the upcoming spring planting and whether the south pasture could support an extra dozen head of cattle, the kind of mundane, practical talk that was, in reality, a beautiful code for a lifetime spent together. Nathan stopped mid-sentence, the gold band glittering in the lamplight as he held it out between them. "I spent 6 years convinced I was a broken man, Emily," he said plainly, his voice steady and true. "I can't promise you a massive empire, but I can promise that I will show up for every fence, every storm, and every single Tuesday for the rest of my days." They were married in February, right in the quiet lull between 2 massive blizzard systems, inside the small timber church in Millbrook, surrounded by the handful of neighbors who truly mattered to them. Emily wore her mother's wedding dress, a gown of heavy ivory wool that was both exceptionally beautiful and entirely practical for a Wyoming winter. And Nathan wore his one good jacket, looking at her as she walked down the aisle with the expression of a man who fully understood the astronomical value of the gift he was being handed. When the spring thaws finally came, they pulled down the old barbed wire fence line that had separated their properties for 8 years, allowing the land to simply become their land, a single sweeping expanse of high plains earth. Under their combined care, the ranch flourished in ways Nathan's old math had never deemed possible. The south pasture produced a rich, abundant yield, and the stubborn old barn finally received the proper deep timber repairs it had been waiting for through 12 long winters. Their firstborn child, a son, arrived in the 3rd year of their marriage, and they named him Thomas after Nathan's father, a fitting tribute to a family line that knew how to rebuild from the ashes. 2 years later, a daughter named Frances joined them, inheriting her father's quiet, patient eyes and her mother's extraordinary, intuitive way with spirited horses.
The years settled into the rich, comfortable rhythm of a life constructed by two people who were genuinely, deeply good at existing in the same space. There were, of course, seasons of profound hardship. A devastating drought in their 7th year wiped out nearly half their livestock, and a brutal winter in their 11th year tested every wall, every fence, and every reserve of strength they possessed. But they met every crisis exactly the way they had fixed the fences in their youth, together, without ever keeping a score of who was carrying the heavier burden. On a golden September evening in their 20th year together, Nathan sat in his favorite rocking chair on the expanded porch, looking out over the prosperous, peaceful ranch in the twilight. He watched his grown son working near the stables and heard his daughter laughing from the kitchen window, and when Emily came out to hand him his coffee, he took her hand and pulled her onto his lap. "I am the wealthiest man in all of Wyoming," he whispered into her hair, "and it only took me 34 years to learn how to count."